She had just turned 18. She was ready to start a new life, free from the home that had become her prison. But before she could escape, she vanished. What happened to Ava Woods? And why did the people who were supposed to love her the most go to such extreme lengths to silence her forever? Ava Woods was not the kind of girl who caused trouble. She wasn't the type to disappear without a trace. She was quiet, studious, the kind of person who blended into the background. She had spent years walking on eggshells, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the household she grew up in. But the truth was, Ava had been living a life no one could see, a life of fear, secrets, and silent suffering. And when she finally decided to break free, to speak out about what had been happening behind closed doors, she was erased. This isn't just a story about a missing person. It's about power, control, and the horrifying reality that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from strangers. They come from inside your own home. It's a case that shocked an entire community, a web of lies that unraveled only after months of searching, and a truth so horrifying that even seasoned detectives struggled to believe it. For years, Ava had endured what no one should ever have to endure. The abuse was relentless, hidden behind the walls of a home that, to the outside world, looked like a place of love and security. She had grown up in the care of Mark and Nathan Woods, a successful, well-respected couple who had built a reputation as devoted parents. They were seen as pillars of their community, known for their generosity and warmth. But what no one knew was that behind closed doors, Ava was trapped in a nightmare. The abuse had started early. Mark Woods, a man who thrived on control, made sure that Ava understood her place. His punishments were swift, his temper unpredictable. But the real horror came from Nathan, the father who appeared softer, gentler, the one who spoke in hushed tones and called himself her protector. Nathan's manipulation was slow, careful, designed to ensure that Ava remained silent. He twisted the meaning of love, creating a world where obedience meant survival. By the time she understood what was happening to her, she was already too deep in his control to escape. Ava had learned how to survive, how to keep quiet, how to exist in a space where speaking up meant consequences she wasn't ready to face. But on her 18th birthday, something changed. She discovered she was pregnant, and suddenly the weight of silence became unbearable. Ava knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't bring a child into that house, into that life. She made a decision that would change everything. She was going to expose the truth. She wasn't just going to leave, she was going to destroy the lie that Mark and Nathan had built for years. She was going to make sure everyone knew what they had done. But she never got the chance. The day before she planned to leave, Ava disappeared. At first, Mark and Nathan told everyone she had run away, that she was struggling emotionally, that she had left a note saying she needed to get away, and at first people believed them. After all, she had just turned 18. Legally, she was an adult. If she wanted to leave, who could stop her? But the people closest to Ava knew something was wrong. She had made plans she wouldn't have abandoned. Her best friend, the only person she had confided in, refused to accept the runaway story. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. And then, months later, the truth surfaced in the most horrifying way possible. A fisherman out on the lake just a few miles from the Woods' home noticed something floating beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was just debris, but as he got closer, he saw the shape of something wrapped in plastic, weighed down with rocks. When authorities arrived and pulled it from the water, the case that had gone cold for months suddenly became a homicide investigation. Inside that plastic, bound and discarded like trash, was Ava Woods. Tonight, we will uncover how investigators pieced together the shocking truth. We will walk through the lies that kept Ava's disappearance hidden, the evidence that finally led to the truth, and the trial that revealed just how far Mark and Nathan Woods were willing to go to silence her. We will explore the missed opportunities, how those around Ava failed to see the signs, how a system designed to protect children had allowed her suffering to go unnoticed. And we will ask the question that lingers long after justice is served. Could this have been prevented? This is a story about trust and betrayal, about what happens when silence is no longer an option, and about the consequences of speaking out when the truth is more dangerous than the lies. Ava Woods had spent her entire life in a house that was both her home and her prison. She was adopted at the age of 2 by Mark and Nathan Woods, a couple whose outward appearance painted a picture of stability, love, and success. To those who knew them, they were the perfect family, a model of progress, 2 devoted fathers giving a child a second chance at life. But for Ava, home was something entirely different. It was a place of rules that felt more like chains, of silences that were louder than screams, of fear masked as love. Mark Woods was the type of man who commanded attention, a successful businessman known for his sharp instincts and unwavering control. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who was never questioned. He was respected in professional circles, admired for his work ethic, and seen as a leader in his community. But at home, that control took on a different shape. Mark expected perfection. He expected obedience. And when those expectations weren't met, he made sure Ava understood the consequences. Discipline, he called it. Teaching lessons, he insisted. But for Ava, it was punishment. Every mistake, no matter how small, had a price. A spilled glass of water, a forgotten chore, an answer given too slow. Each misstep led to the same outcome: pain, humiliation, isolation. Over the years, Ava learned how to avoid the worst of it. She kept quiet. She moved carefully. She disappeared into the background, hoping that by making herself small, she could avoid his wrath. But Mark wasn't the only danger in that house. Nathan Woods was different. He was softer, quieter. He was the one who told Ava everything was okay, the one who promised he was there to protect her. He would whisper words of comfort after Mark's punishments, tell her she was special, that she was the only one who truly understood him. And for a long time, Ava believed him. She needed to believe him. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't understand at first, was that Nathan's kindness wasn't kindness at all. It was a mask, a slow, deliberate way of ensuring her silence. It started with moments that felt off, a touch that lasted too long, a compliment that didn't sound right. She was too young to recognize what was happening, too confused to put words to the feeling in her gut that something was wrong. But as the years went by, the truth became unavoidable. Nathan's love was not the love of a father, and by the time she realized it, she was trapped. Ava was caught between 2 men, one who used violence to keep her in line, and one who used manipulation to keep her silent. She had no one to turn to, no way to explain what was happening to her. To the world, her family was perfect. No one would believe her, and so she did what she had always done. She endured. But endurance can only last for so long, and everything changed when she turned 18. For the first time, she saw a way out. She was legally an adult. She could leave. She could walk out the door and never come back. And more than that, she could finally tell the truth. The years of silence, the secrets, the pain. She was ready to expose it all. But before she could, she discovered something that changed everything. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. It was no longer just about her. The life growing inside her was a reminder of everything she had suffered, a piece of a reality she never wanted to carry. But it was also the final push she needed. She couldn't stay. She couldn't let this cycle continue. And so Ava made a decision that would cost her everything. She was going to leave. She was going to tell the world what had happened to her. She had started gathering evidence, photos, notes, recordings. She confided in a friend, someone she trusted to help her escape. She planned to go to the police, to make sure Mark and Nathan Woods never hurt anyone again. And most importantly, she was going to make sure her child never set foot inside that house. But Ava never made it to the police station. She never got to pack her bags. She never got to take the first step toward freedom, because on the night before she planned to leave, she disappeared. Ava Woods had waited for this moment her entire life, the chance to finally walk away. For years, she had endured. She had lived in silence, forcing herself to believe that if she just held on long enough, if she just kept her head down, one day she would be free. And now that day had come. She had turned 18. She was an adult. The door that had always been locked now had no key, no chain. just a decision waiting to be made. But before she could take that step, everything changed. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter, a single result staring back at her. Pregnant. The word seemed unreal, impossible, and yet there it was, a truth she couldn't escape. Her body trembled as she gripped the sink, her mind racing through every possibility, every consequence. She had spent years surviving inside that house, enduring the punishments, the manipulation, the nights that felt like they would never end. But now she wasn't just carrying the weight of her own survival, she was carrying someone else. And she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't stay. Not another night, not another second. Ava had been preparing for this moment for months, slowly collecting pieces of her escape plan. She had gathered evidence, photos of bruises, a diary filled with details of every time Nathan had come into her room, recordings of whispered threats. She knew that without proof, no one would believe her. Mark and Nathan had spent years crafting their image, shaping the narrative of their perfect family. But the truth was far from perfect, and now she had the evidence to prove it. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she texted the only person she trusted, her best friend Mia. They had spent hours talking about this day, making plans. Mia had promised that when Ava was ready, she would be there. And now Ava was ready. "Tonight," Ava wrote, "I'm leaving tonight." But fate had other plans. Mark was watching. He always was. His control over Ava wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He knew her patterns, her behaviors. He could tell when something was off. And tonight, something was off. At dinner, Ava barely spoke. She pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. Nathan was his usual self, calm, controlled, acting as if nothing in the world could disturb the balance they had created. But Mark was different. His eyes were sharp, his presence heavier than usual. He could sense it, an energy in the air, a shift in Ava's demeanor. She wasn't afraid anymore, and that terrified him. Then a mistake, one text too many, a moment of distraction. Ava's phone buzzed, and before she could reach for it, Mark snatched it from the table. The room fell silent. "Who's Mia?" Mark's voice was cold, calculated. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She had been careful, so careful, but now it was too late. He scrolled through the messages, his jaw tightening with every word. The escape plan, the pregnancy, the threat of police, the truth laid out in a single conversation. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ava felt the walls closing in, the air thick with something unspoken. Nathan looked at Mark, his expression unreadable. And then, without a word, Mark stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He placed the phone on the table. Calm, controlled, unshaken. "Go to your room, Ava," he said. And she knew this wasn't a request. This was a command, a warning. Ava wanted to run, she wanted to fight, but she knew better. She had learned long ago that defiance had consequences. So she stood, she walked. Step by step, she made her way up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might stop. When she reached her bedroom, she turned the lock behind her, pressing her back against the door. Her mind screamed for her to do something. Call for help, break a window, climb down and run. But before she could move, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer, and then the click of the lock, the creak of the door, and then nothing. That was the last time anyone saw Ava Woods alive. The next morning, the Woods household was eerily quiet. The sun rose over the neighborhood like any other day, but inside the house, something had shifted. There was no sign of Ava, no footsteps creaking across the wooden floors, no sounds of movement from her room, just silence. Mark and Nathan Woods carried on as if nothing had changed. They went about their morning routine, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, exchanging quiet conversation. But beneath that stillness, a cover-up was already in motion. When Mia woke up that morning, she checked her phone, expecting to see a message from Ava. Something, anything, to let her know she was safe. But there was nothing. Hours passed. Mia sent text after text, but none were delivered. Panic set in. Something was wrong. Ava had planned everything. She wouldn't have just vanished without a word. She had promised. She had a plan. So where was she? By midday, Mia was at Ava's house, knocking on the front door. Mark answered, his expression calm, his voice carrying an air of practiced concern. He told her that Ava had run away, that she had been struggling, overwhelmed, and had left a note explaining everything. But something about it felt off. The note Mark showed to Mia was brief, too brief. Ava had never mentioned writing it, and the wording felt wrong, cold, distant, like it had been crafted by someone else. Mia pressed for details, but Mark remained unwavering. Ava had packed a bag, he claimed. She had left. It was her choice. But Mia didn't believe him. She knew Ava better than anyone, and nothing about this made sense. Still, what could she do? Ava was 18. If she had truly run away, law enforcement wouldn't treat it as a priority. Without clear signs of foul play, there was nothing they could do. Days passed, then weeks. Ava's name slowly faded from the conversations of those who had once been concerned. People began to accept the story they had been given. But Mia refused to let go. She went to the police. She filed a missing persons report. She called every friend Ava had ever spoken to, but there were no leads, no signs of where Ava might have gone, no bank withdrawals, no social media activity. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The Woods family played the part of grieving parents perfectly. They spoke to neighbors, telling them how devastated they were. They held a small vigil, inviting friends and acquaintances to pray for Ava's safe return. They expressed heartbreak, sorrow, regret that they hadn't seen the signs earlier. But the truth was, they weren't grieving. They were waiting. And then months later, the truth surfaced in the most horrifying way imaginable. It was a fisherman who found her, out on the lake, miles away from the Woods' home. He had been casting his line, his boat drifting lazily across the water, when something caught his eye. A shape beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was debris, but as he got closer, dread settled in his gut. The body was wrapped in plastic, tied with rope, weighed down with rocks. When authorities arrived, they worked quickly, carefully bringing the remains to shore. The body was barely recognizable. The water had taken its toll, but there was enough left to confirm what many had feared. It was Ava Woods. The runaway story collapsed in an instant. This was no case of a troubled teen leaving home. This was something much darker, something far worse. Now the question wasn't, where is Ava Woods? It was, who killed her? The news of Ava Woods' body being found spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. What was once believed to be a case of a young girl running away had now transformed into something far more disturbing. The idea that Ava had simply vanished by choice no longer held weight. Someone had wanted her gone. Someone had made sure she wouldn't leave that house alive. The condition of the body told its own story. Forensic examiners worked carefully to uncover what the water had tried to erase. Despite months of decomposition, key details remained. The plastic wrap around her was industrial, heavy-duty, the kind used in home renovations. The rope binding her limbs had been knotted with precision. The rocks weighing her down had been deliberately chosen, their placement methodical. This wasn't a haphazard crime. It was planned. But the most chilling discovery came during the autopsy. Ava hadn't died from drowning. She was dead before she hit the water. Forensic experts determined that Ava had been strangled. Bruising around her neck, faint even after months underwater, confirmed it. Her hyoid bone, a small, fragile structure in the throat, was fractured, a clear sign of forceful compression. This was no accident. This was murder. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they turned their focus to the last people who had seen Ava alive, Mark and Nathan Woods. The story Mark had given, Ava packing a bag, leaving a note, was suddenly under scrutiny. Detectives visited the Woods' home, this time not for a welfare check, but for answers. And it didn't take long for the cracks to show. One of the first red flags was the so-called runaway note. Handwriting experts analyzed the letter Mark had shown Mia, comparing it to Ava's previous writing samples. The results were damning. The inconsistencies were glaring. The stroke patterns, the way the letters were formed. It was close, but not close enough. The note had been forged. Then came the home search. Authorities obtained a warrant, and what they found only deepened their suspicions. The same industrial plastic that had been wrapped around Ava's body? Rolls of it were sitting in the Woods garage. The same brand, the same width, the same thickness. But that wasn't all. The rope. Detectives found an identical coil of rope in the basement, still partially used, its fibers matching those found on Ava. And then there was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. Traces of blood, faint but present, found in Ava's bedroom on the floorboards beneath her bed. The story Mark and Nathan had so carefully crafted was unraveling. Detectives knew they had their suspects, but now they needed to know the truth. Who had done it, and why? When brought in for questioning, Mark Woods was cold, calculated. He denied everything, claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that Ava had been troubled, that she had likely been attacked after she left their home. But Nathan was different. He cracked. During hours of interrogation, Nathan's demeanor shifted. The calm, composed mask he had worn for months began to slip. His hands shook. His voice wavered. And then he spoke. And what he said changed everything. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Those words were the first break in the case. The moment investigators knew they had found the person who could expose the truth. The interrogation room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Nathan Woods sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly together, his shoulders tense. He had been sitting in this chair for hours, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. Across from him, detectives waited, watching, knowing that he was close to breaking. And then he whispered the words that changed everything. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The detectives leaned in. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the first crack in the foundation of the lie that had held up for months. But they needed more. They needed the full truth. Then how was it supposed to happen, Nathan? One of them asked, voice steady, controlled. Nathan swallowed hard, his fingers tapped nervously against the table. And then, as if the words had been waiting just beneath the surface, he began to talk. She was going to ruin everything, he muttered, his eyes avoiding the detectives. She said she was leaving, that she was going to the police, that she was pregnant. His voice faltered at the last word, as if saying it out loud made it real. So Mark killed her. The detective's voice was sharp now, pushing him further. Nathan shook his head. No, he whispered, not at first. The room fell silent. He tried to reason with her, Nathan continued, told her she didn't understand what she was doing, that she'd regret it, but she wouldn't stop. She wasn't afraid anymore. He paused, running a hand through his thinning hair. That's when he lost it. He grabbed her, Nathan said, his voice now hollow. She fought. She screamed. I tried to stop him. I swear I did. But he wouldn't let go. His hands clenched into fists. He wrapped his hands around her throat and just kept squeezing. How long? One of the detectives asked. Too long, Nathan whispered. The room was heavy with silence. Everyone inside knew that this was the confession they had been waiting for. But there was more. And then, the detective pressed. I told him we had to call someone. We had to fix it. His breathing was shallow now. But he said no. Said there was only one way out of this. He told me to help him, and I did. What did you do, Nathan? The question came firm, but calm. We wrapped her up. The plastic, the one from the garage. We tied the rocks to her, put her in the back of the car, drove out to the lake. It was the middle of the night. No one saw us. His voice cracked. We dropped her in. Just let her sink. And then we drove home like nothing happened. The room was still. The detectives exchanged glances. They had everything they needed. But there was one last question. Why? Nathan exhaled sharply, his eyes wet. Because we thought we could get away with it. The confession was enough. Within hours, detectives moved in. Mark Woods was arrested at his home, still clinging to his version of events. He denied everything, claiming Nathan was lying to save himself. But the evidence, the forged note, the plastic, the rope, the blood, was overwhelming. When news of the arrest broke, the community was shaken. The men who had once been admired, respected, seen as loving fathers, were now exposed as monsters. People who had once defended them now looked at them in horror. As they were led out of their home in handcuffs, reporters swarmed. Questions were shouted, cameras flashed. But Mark Woods remained stone-faced, unmoved. He still believed he could control the situation, still believed he could talk his way out of it. Nathan, on the other hand, was already falling apart. As he was escorted into the police car, his head was down, his face pale. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate. The courtroom was packed. The case had drawn nationwide attention. Every seat was filled. Family members, reporters, complete strangers who had followed the story from the beginning. People wanted to see justice. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. They walked the jury through Ava's life, through the years of abuse she had endured. They played the recordings she had saved, showed the diary entries she had written in secret. They revealed the details of her pregnancy, the final truth she had discovered before her death. And most importantly, they had Nathan's confession. The defense tried to argue that Nathan had acted under duress, that Mark had manipulated him into helping cover up the crime. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the sentencing. Mark Woods was found guilty of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. Nathan Woods, for his role in covering up the crime, was sentenced to 25 years. A plea deal had spared him a life sentence, but his days of freedom were over. As the verdict was read, there was no reaction from Mark, no sign of remorse, no sign of regret. Nathan, however, collapsed into himself, his head in his hands, the weight of his choices finally sinking in. The trial was over. Justice in the eyes of the law had been served. But for those who had loved Ava, the verdict did little to ease the pain. She was still gone. Her life had still been stolen. The story of Ava Woods is more than just a crime. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that abuse can hide in plain sight, that the people we trust the most can sometimes be the ones who betray us in ways we never thought possible. Ava fought until the end. She was ready to break free, to tell her story, to reclaim her life, but she was silenced before she ever got the chance. And so, we tell it for her. The truth was buried once, but it will not be buried again. The courtroom doors closed. The verdict had been reached. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. But outside those walls, the weight of Ava Woods' story lingered. Her name became more than just a headline, more than just another case in the system. She became a symbol, a reminder of the voices that are silenced far too soon, a reflection of the darkness that can exist within the very walls meant to protect us. But as the dust settled, questions remained, questions that will never truly have answers. Would Ava still be alive if someone had stepped in sooner? If a teacher, a neighbor, a family friend had noticed the signs and said something? Would she have been able to escape if Mark hadn't discovered her plan that night? Could she have built the life she was so desperate to create, a life away from the horrors she had known? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how many others are out there right now, living in silence, trapped in homes they cannot escape? The story of Ava Woods is one of tragedy, but it is also one of resilience. She was not weak, she was not passive, she fought, she planned, she tried to break free. And that is what makes her story so haunting. She was right there, so close to the freedom she had been waiting for her entire life, and then it was taken from her. But her voice was not erased. It lives on in every person who hears her story, in every survivor who sees a piece of themselves in her pain, in every law enforcement officer, every social worker, every advocate who fights to make sure no one else suffers the way she did. Because Ava was not just another victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams, hopes, a future she never got to live. And now all we can do is remember. Ava's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about control, about the dangers that can exist in places we least expect. It raises a question we all have to ask ourselves. How often do we turn a blind eye? How often do we ignore the quiet suffering of others simply because it is easier to believe that everything is fine? The reality is that abuse does not always look the way we expect it to. It does not always come with bruises. It does not always come with cries for help. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence, and that silence can be the loudest cry of all. For years, Ava's silence protected the very people who destroyed her. It is a pattern seen over and over again in cases like hers. Victims stay quiet because they are made to believe they have no other choice, because fear is a more powerful weapon than any lock or chain. And for years, no one asked the right questions, no one saw the signs, or maybe no one wanted to see them. But the silence broke, and when it did, it shattered everything. If there is anything to take from this case, it is this. Ava Woods should have been saved. She should have had the chance to live the life she dreamed of. She should have been able to walk away, to be free, to raise the child she never got to meet. But she wasn't. And that failure falls on more than just Mark and Nathan Woods. It falls on the system that failed to protect her. It falls on the people who looked the other way. It falls on a world that too often chooses comfort over truth. Ava did everything she could. She fought. She found her voice. She tried to break free. But in the end, it wasn't enough. And now we are left with the responsibility of making sure that next time, it is. So now I ask you, what do you think? Could Ava's story have ended differently? Should the warning signs have been noticed sooner? And most importantly, what can we do to make sure stories like hers do not keep repeating? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Because these conversations matter. Because stories like Ava's matter. Because if her voice was taken from her, then the least we can do is make sure it is never forgotten. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, if it left you with questions, then join us. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories to tell. More voices that deserve to be heard, and together we can make sure that the silence is broken before it's too late. Thank you for watching, and remember, monsters do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live right inside the home.